Going to give it just one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, everyone, depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon. This is the fiscal year 2023 Community Project Funding Grantees Cohort Session 3 for Environmental Review Processes and Considerations. I'm Patrick Roberts. I am a consultant with Civics and recently have had the privilege of working on developing work aids for the environmental review process directly with the CPF program analysts, the CPF grant officers, specialists, the environmental clearance officer from HUD, along with my cohort for this cohort, Stan, who will have him introduce himself here in just a moment. But first, I'd like to go through some of the logistics for this session, and I'm going to introduce you all to some specific resources. So as usual, participants are going to be muted during the webinar. The PowerPoint presentation will be available on the HUD Exchange. It may take a bit, but it will be available, and all attendees should receive a notification of when that presentation is available. There's also, I want to introduce you to the program support HUD Exchange link that is also a good resource for y'all to go to. And I believe that you've all received an advanced copy of this presentation, so that link should be an active link in the version that you received. Also, I want to show you the HUD Exchange. There's an Ask a Question help desk for any type of question that you have on your CPF grant. And then also really do want to highlight for you, in case you all have not been introduced to this, we do encourage you all to sign up for listserv also on the HUD Exchange. This is going to be used more and more and has been used more and more to communicate everything new that's going on with community project funding. And we'll be putting out notifications of new resources that get uploaded, upcoming trainings, webinars, and other resources that should be helpful in implementing your CPF grants. So please, if you have not, create an account on the HUD Exchange and sign up for listserv to get all of the most up-to-date information that's being provided by HUD. For content-related questions during this presentation, please use the Zoom chat feature. You are encouraged to submit your questions as we go through the presentation while you're thinking about them, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. And anything that we need to follow up on, we will log those questions and answer them later. The questions that for this presentation If you do have any that are project specific, we will provide likely a general answer, but anything that needs a specific answer for a project specific question, we will encourage you to contact your grant officer, and your grant officer can also put you in touch with your regional environmental contact. Okay, as I mentioned, um, my cohort for this cohort is Stan Fitterman. And Stan, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can give a quick introduction.
Oh, okay, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I'm Stan Fitterman with SFF Consulting Group. I am, in addition to having done this work for type of work with HUD programs and affordable housing and community and economic development for almost 30 years, I reluctantly have become a environmental review person, mainly because I did a sabbatical for a few years as a developer, and I was sitting where y'all were sitting and had to get my projects through the environmental review process. So I'll be here as backup for Patrick, as his cohort in the cohort, as he like to say. And Patrick, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Very good, Stan. We're lucky to have you on. Uh, as I mentioned, I'm a consultant with Civics. I have experience also in construction management as an administrative director, responsible for the implementation of new projects from project design, working with local municipalities on permitting. So I've been on the construction side, working with municipalities on getting permits and environmental review processes completed, as well as working at the state and local government level for policy setting, working with the state of Iowa and New York in disaster recovery, working on program management and the cross-cutting requirements, including environmental review. So being involved in construction and disaster recovery, where federal funding is involved, you learn early that it's essential to have a foundational understanding of the environmental review process and the many different concepts and requirements and regulations that weave throughout that review process. So today we're going to do a review of the environmental review process. And to some, this may be a refresher. Never hurts to have that refresher on environmental review. So can be a complicated process. To others, this overview could be your introduction into the exciting world of environmental review. And hopefully, everyone will be able to say that they learned something to improve their understanding of the environmental review process, and that new understanding will hopefully benefit your project moving forward. The overview is going to cover a wide range of topics, starting with the question, answering the question of what is environmental review, and then ending with some talking points through some considerations of community project funding. So let's get started. So what is an environmental review? An environmental review is an analysis that a project will have, it's an analysis of the impacts that a project will have on its surrounding environment and how that environment can affect the project. So incidentally, step one of the environmental review is to develop a detailed project description. And hopefully you all attending today uh, have had that opportunity to attend the other cohorts that talked about your project description and project summary. So that summary document is part of, or step one of, your environmental review. That detailed project description can also be a part of your project narrative. So there are some good connections that we're trying to make between those different steps in gaining your CPF funding. The completed review demonstrates that HUD-funded projects have complied with all of the applicable laws and authorities and ensures that those projects provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing where a housing project is involved. An environmental review is required for all HUD-assisted projects, and is a public document used to encourage public participation. And while HUD assisted projects require an environmental review, not all projects require the same level of effort to complete that review, which we'll take a look at here in the next slide. So this slide includes a rough breakdown of each level of review to illustrate which levels of review are more common and to highlight capacity and timing considerations. So you can see that there are a few different levels of review. Projects require different levels of review based on the nature and the scope of the project activities. As we go through these different levels, it may prompt a question that is specific to your own project and what level of review it might be. If that does happen to you, again, we recommend touching base with your regional environmental officer to discuss the project specific details. So starting from the left-hand side, there's the exempt and the CENST level of review, which is categorically excluded, not subject to certain laws and authorities. And these are more like soft costs like design, pre-design from architecture, preparing an environmental review, including the cost of hiring an environmental consultant to prepare the review. Those are all soft costs, and those are all covered by a nationwide review that HUD did for CPF projects and can be incurred anytime after the federal nexus, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Also includes services, operational costs, most maintenance activities. There aren't many laws and authorities to address. They have very limited compliance requirements and can be done often very quickly. As you see, there could be 30 minutes up to 2 hours. HUD's been seeing a lot more of these types of reviews for the CPS funding because there are just a lot more activities happening within this type of scope of soft costs that HUD is seeing coming through. Now, the next level is the CEST level of review, which is the categorically excluded, but is subject to the laws and authorities of 58.5. These can be refinancing, minor rehabilitation, single family housing construction. The projects under this level of review are much smaller type projects than the next level of review, which is the environmental assessment. These are larger multifamily construction projects, as you see there. Also include infrastructure projects and project types that go beyond just the minimal groundbreaking of the CEST. These can take a bit longer to review. They require compliance with all of the federal environmental laws and authorities, including a NEPA analysis, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is known as the environmental assessment factors analysis. And we see fewer projects at this level. And then the highest level of review is the environmental impact statement. And these are extremely rare for the CPF, or have been extremely rare thus far. These are large scale infrastructure projects with 2,500 plus housing units. Some of these can be disaster related projects, but really we're not going to see very many of these projects, or the projects fall into this level of review, not under the this community project funding program. It also includes large scale infrastructure like highways, bridges, transmission lines. But a couple of things to take note here is that the level of review in all of these, it's not dependent on the amount of funding involved in the project, but it's dependent on the level of potential impact to the environment that the project may have. And then two, the second thing to take note of is that staffing and timing considerations. These different levels of review do require different levels of staff capacity in terms of your local government's capacity to conduct the environmental review for the CPF grants. This next slide here is the federal environmental laws and authorities, and depending on the project's level of review, which we just discussed, a HUD environmental review may have to consider a wide variety of environmental laws and authorities. This does include the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, Historical Preservation, Site Contamination, Floodplain Management, Noise Abatement, and so on. Under NEPA and its implementing regulations, all federal agencies have a duty to assess the impacts of the major actions they propose to undertake and to consider reasonable alternatives to choose from to reduce or eliminate those impacts. These alternatives will be referred to later as choices. So this slide here, it's kind of the universe of the environmental laws and authorities that your project may need to comply with. So let's get into the regulations that govern the review process that you all need to have completed for your projects. It's 24 CFR Part 58, and then later we'll also discuss 24 CFR Part 50. So environmental reviews for projects under Part 58 are completed by a unit of general local government in which the project is located in. The unit of general government serves as the responsible entity and conducts the environmental review for the project. Under CPF's legislation, it allows for the environmental reviews to be completed under Part 58 by a unit of general local government as the responsible entity, and this is the default for the CPF programs. So HUD is hoping that projects are all being done, or we're doing everything that we can, and HUD will do everything that they can to encourage that the unit of general local government in which the project is located in is serving as the responsible entity and does conduct the environmental review whenever possible. However, sometimes nonprofit recipients cannot secure a local government responsible entity to conduct their review. And if that does happen, then they'll need to reach out to HUD to complete the review under Part 50. And we'll talk a little bit more about Part 50 in just a bit. So this has been a reoccurring question. So the default or the desired methodology is for a general local government entity to be the responsible entity and to conduct the environmental review whenever possible. Under Part 58, the grantee or the recipient provides all of the necessary information to the local government acting as the responsible entity to complete the environmental review for the project. This could involve hiring an environmental consultant to essentially collect, gather, and compile all of that information, and then they provide it to the responsible entity. That will really be something that you'll need to decide, the local government, as to whether or not you have the staff capacity to conduct the environmental review, or if you need to hire an environmental consultant to essentially do the legwork and compile all of the content. And then the local government would independently review and verify all of that information. If a project does rise to the CEST, which is the categorically excluded subject to, or if it rises beyond that to the environmental assessment level of review, which those are the things we covered a few slides ago, the local government responsible entity will need to publish a public notice of finding from the environmental review, a notice of intent to request a release of funds and allow for the appropriate public comment period to collect and address any comments received from the public. So there's this process here of submitting the request for release of funds. HUD processes also then an authority to use grant funds. And then there's this final step where the responsible entity maintains an electric copy of the Part 58. The responsible entity may proceed with the project at that time. And there's also the HUD conducting monitoring of the grantee or the responsible entity following project completion. And then also listing this one last because we'll talk about it some more. The responsible entity or grantee implements any required mitigation. Under Part 58 or Part 50, this is a regulation that governs when HUD conducts the environmental review instead of the local government. Again, Part 58 is when the local government conducts the environmental review. Now under Part 50, grantees request that HUD conducts the review and provides all necessary requested project information to the HUD environmental officer. Again, it's still up to the grantee to provide all the information requested and necessary to complete the environmental review. The environmental officer then completes the review, conducts any necessary consultation with any environmental authorities, and then they certify and approve the review. After that, the environmental officer will provide a copy of the environmental review record to the Congressional Grants Division grant officer, who will then provide a copy to the grantee so that the grantee has a copy of that environmental review record. And then once the environmental review has been approved and the grantee has a copy of that environmental review record that has been approved, the grantee can then proceed with the project. But again, must also implement and monitor any mitigation that's prescribed by the environmental review. So if it's under Part 58 and HUD is conducting the review, HUD will inform the grantee if there are any mitigation measures that need to be implemented. And mitigation describes an effort that agencies must make to avoid or minimize the environmental impacts resulting from the project. Now, you can take note here that in this graphic, that unlike Part 58, where the local government conducts the review and informs the public and then requests the release of funds, and then HUD issues that authorization to use grant funds, that process does not exist under Part 50, where HUD conducts the review, because essentially HUD is already certifying that the review is essentially approved. We don't need to go through that additional approval process with HUD. So under Part 50, HUD conducts the review and HUD certifies the environmental review. And while this may seem like it would take less time under Part 50, where HUD is conducting the environmental review, you have to keep in mind that HUD's environmental staff capacity to take on large numbers of Part 50 reviews is limited. So we encourage environmental reviews for CPF to remain under Part 58, where the local government responsible entity can complete the review. So a quick recap to this point. The environmental review is conducted to determine if the project will have an impact on the environmental surroundings, as well as to determine if the environment will have any impact on the project. 2, there are different levels of review depending on the type of project you have. 3, there are 2 different primary regulations that govern the environmental review process, Part 58 and Part 50. Environmental reviews must have a responsible entity. And 5, a satisfactory review process must be completed before the funds to cover the project costs can be released. Going forward, I'm going to call out some terms for you to be listening for as we go forward. These will be some of the key terms that will be covered in the upcoming slides. Legislative enactment, the federal nexus, pre-nexus contract date, and then finally choice limiting actions. This next slide is about the date of legislative enactment. So this is an important date for your CPF project and grant. And this is the date that Congress appropriated the funds for the community project funding for that fiscal year. And the reason it's important is because any costs that are incurred or any activities that have been performed prior to the date of the legislative enactment are not eligible for repayment and do not need to be included in the environmental review for the project. Again, any costs that were incurred or activities performed prior to the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year is not eligible for repayment, and it does not need to be included in the environmental review for the project. So for this cohort, the date of legislative enactment is December 29, 2022. Next is the federal nexus and choice limiting actions that we'll talk about. The federal nexus is the point at which a project becomes federalized and when federal environmental review requirements are triggered. Again, the federal nexus date for fiscal year 2023 cohorts is December 29, 2022. Just real quick, if you've also attended an environmental review session for 2022 cohorts, you'll see that federal nexus information is different than the legislative enactment date. So just important to know for this group, the federal nexus date is December 29, 2022, which is also the enactment date. The grantee's local government responsible entity or HUD will be required to complete a satisfactory environmental review covering all work that took place or is proposed to take place after the federal nexus date. And that environmental review needs to be completed prior to requesting payment from HUD for those activities. That last bullet there, after the federal nexus, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions related to hard costs unless part of a pre-nexus contract, including commitment or expenditure of HUD and non-HUD funds until a satisfactory review has been completed. So after the federal nexus date, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions related to hard costs unless they're part of a pre-nexus contract, but that including commitment or expenditures of funds. So prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions, including commitment or expenditure of HUD and not HUD funds until a satisfactory environmental review has been completed for the project. So a couple of slides ago, I mentioned the concept of reasonable alternatives and how those would be called choices. So I shared that under NEPA and its implementing regulations that all federal agencies have a duty to assess the impacts of the major actions they propose to undertake and to consider reasonable alternatives to choose from to reduce or eliminate those impacts, and that these alternatives will be referred to later as choices. We've arrived at that later point in the presentation. After the federal nexus, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions related to hard costs, including commitment or expenditure of HUD or non-HUD funds until a satisfactory environmental review has been completed for the project. have been, I think that's maybe the third, possibly fourth time that that sentence has come up in the presentation, and it's an important one. So just taking note of the new choice limiting actions are prohibited until a satisfactory environmental review has been completed for the project. A choice limiting action is any activity that a grantee undertakes, again, including committing or expending HUD or non HUD funds, that would reduce or eliminate a grantee the opportunity to choose a project alternative that may avoid or minimize environmental impacts. So, if the environmental review has not been completed, then that analysis of reasonable alternatives to choose from has not been completed either. By taking an action without considering those alternatives, that essentially binds the project to a narrowed course or cutting off the possibility of alternatives prior to completing the environmental review. That is considered a choice limiting action. Now, there is one nuance to this, and that will be an important one that we'll cover in just a moment. So, this prohibition on choice limiting actions is true for all soft and hard cost activities and actions, unless those actions are part of a pre nexus contractual obligation, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. But essentially, this prohibition on taking choice limiting actions is in effect for all soft and hard costs and activities and actions that are carried out after the federal nexus. Some examples of choice limiting actions, as you see here, include acquisition, rehabilitation, demolition, new construction, ground disturbance. Given three examples of the ground disturbance there: clearing, grading, and grubbing, or entering into contracts or commitment for hard costs for construction or any other hard cost work is a choice limiting action. These again are actions that limit your choice of project alternatives. So if you're already acquiring land or a site, you're committing to that site. You're committing the project to that site. That's why it's a choice limiting action, because you're limiting the choice of alternatives. Same thing with leasing. Same thing with leasing a structure or a property, or rehabbing or conducting rehab, performing rehab in a particular building. If you're doing those things prior to that environmental review consideration, you're limiting your choices of doing this project in another location. Obviously, same thing with demolition. If you've already demolished a structure, or if you're constructing a new one, you're really limiting yourself to that site, that structure for the project. So these are all examples of choice limiting actions that cannot be taken after the federal nexus until the environmental review is complete. That's kind of the whole purpose of the environmental review, is to evaluate a site and its conditions before you take those actions. Now, again, for that nuance, after the federal nexus, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions, except for actions that are part of a pre nexus contractual obligation, until that satisfactory review has been completed. So, although activities that were committed to under a pre nexus contract are technically allowed, physical actions taken after the nexus may prevent a satisfactory environmental review, preventing drawdown of the grant funds. So all activities performed after that federal nexus are subject to a satisfactory review in order for the project to be eligible for payment. So it's that idea of, um, if you if you have a pre-Nexus contract that has soft and hard costs, you've already committed to that prior to the Nexus date, those actions are technically allowed, and they are allowed as actions that would not be considered choice limiting because you are under a pre-Nexus contract. However, all of the actions that you take and the result of those actions still need to pass the environmental review. So just to recap, activities committed after the Nexus date but associated with the pre-Nexus contract are technically allowed, will not be considered choice limiting actions, still need to be cleared as part of the environmental review process, and those are activities that are taken at the grantee's own risk. We will talk again about pre-Nexus contracts later in the presentation as well as it relates to cost eligibility. So moving on, let's talk some about soft costs in a little more detail here. So some of the soft costs, excuse me, most of the soft costs are covered um, are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for the CPF soft costs. Some, but not all, are. HUD conducting a nationwide programmatic environmental review for the entire CPF program covers most, but not all. And you can find the link to each review here on this slide, as well as on the CPF landing pages. And you can see a list of which soft costs are covered in the project description of that environmental review record. So you can just click that link, pulls up the nationwide environmental review record that HUD conducted for soft costs, and you will see in the project description, it lists out all the types of soft costs that are covered by the review. Again, in general, planning, administrative, and operating costs are all covered. Also take note that the cost of preparing an environmental review, including the cost of hiring an environmental consultant to prepare the review, are also considered soft costs covered by the nationwide review. Maintenance activities that comply with HUD's Notice 16-02, which you see the link there on this slide, is the guidance for categorizing an activity as maintenance for compliance with HUD's environmental review. The maintenance activities that comply with that notice are covered by HUD's Part 50 review for soft costs. And with the recent legislative change that were enacted for both fiscal years 22 and 23 last December, there's no longer a cap on how much of your CPF grant can go towards soft costs. However, if you intend to repurpose, it states it right there on that bullet point, if you intend to repurpose your grant to 100% soft costs, you must get approval from your grant officer to see if that's appropriate and potentially a path forward there. Now, all soft costs covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs can be incurred anytime after the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year grant. So there's another important reason to know that date of legislative enactment. Most soft costs are covered by nationwide. As we mentioned, that nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs can be incurred anytime after December 29, 2022, and can be drawn down for repayment after the grant agreement for the project has been executed. I mentioned a couple of times that it does cover most soft costs, but not all. And there are some soft costs that are not covered. If you have those soft costs in your project that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 review, you will need to complete a separate exempt or a CENST determination, environmental review determination, by the responsible entity or by HUD prior to incurring those costs before you start incurring those non-covered soft costs. It's essentially just a determination that it's exempt or not subject to. Those two are the ones that there's some compliance with few laws and authorities, and it's that quick level of review. So it can be done very quickly. We can talk more about those soft costs that are not covered here on the next slide. So this is the slide that has a breakdown of covered and not covered soft costs. Also provides their corresponding regulatory citation as well. So covered soft costs include environmental and other studies, resource identification, development of plans and strategies, information and financial advisory services, administrative and management expenses, public services, inspections, testing, purchase of insurance, engineering or design costs, technical assistance and training, and various supportive services. Operating costs are also covered, including most maintenance activities, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But what we mean here is as well as purchase of vehicles, but not the purchase of other equipment. So, sorry, we'll talk more about the non-covered, that the maintenance activities that are and are not on the next slide. So these are all the soft costs that are covered by Nationwide down the left side, and then the activities not covered that would require a separate environmental review determination, which again you can do quickly. It can be separate from the larger environmental review, considering the whole project, but it still needs to be put in place by the responsible entity. So soft costs that are not covered by Part 50 Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs are costs such as purchase of tools, emergency assistance necessary to control or arrest the effects from disaster or imminent threats to public safety, tenant-based rental assistance, economic development activities, affordable housing pre-development costs, and approval of supplemental assistance as well. Now, the reason some of these soft costs are not covered by HUD's nationwide review is because there is a chance they may require compliance with one or more laws or authorities, which would depend on the nature, the extent, and the location of the activity, which HUD could not account for in the nationwide review. It would be difficult for HUD to know where all the projects would be located and to know what the environmental conditions of the projects would be. HUD could only do this kind of broad level environmental review to cover certain costs because some of these other costs may again require additional compliance with, for instance, flood insurance requirements. So again, HUD completed the nationwide environmental review for all soft costs that HUD could readily clear at a nationwide level. But then those soft costs that may require that additional compliance with one or more laws and authorities that HUD was not able to ensure, they had to leave those out of that nationwide level of review. And if you have any additional questions about whether your specific soft costs are covered or not, or if they would require their own environmental review, please reach out and discuss with your environmental officer, which again, will provide a link to that contact info at the end of this presentation. This next slide shows that the table from HUD's notice on categorizing activities as maintenance for the purpose of environmental review. So if you recall from the last slide, under the covered cost, it included operating costs, including most maintenance activities. So this is how you would determine whether an activity is maintenance and whether or not that maintenance activity is actually covered by the Part 50 nationwide review for soft costs. As you can see, the table shows different types of activities and whether they are considered maintenance or rehab for environmental review purposes. So all the activities listed under rehab, which is the column on the far right, are not covered by HUD's nationwide review and would need to be included in a separate satisfactory environmental review for the project prior to being performed. All activities listed under maintenance, which is the middle column, except for the ones with the asterisks near them. You can see them at the very bottom. There's the last one has an asterisk near it. It is sorry. So the ones without the asterisks, those are covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review. Those activities that have the asterisks, you'll see there at the bottom, they may require that additional level of review or additional separate review. That's the one that installation or replacement of carpeting or vinyl flooring. You see here the maintenance items may require the purchase of flood insurance if they incur in a special flood hazard area and the cost exceed the standard deductible for the specific type of structure or unit under the National Flood Insurance. That's why that one was not able to be readily part of that HUD Part 50 nationwide review for soft costs. So moving on to hard costs and how to handle work that was already under contract. So you recall following the federal nexus, no party may enter into additional construction contracts or take other new limiting choice limiting actions like commitments or actions including spending funds or performing physical work until the environmental review process is complete and all necessary approvals are received. However, the one important caveat is regarding work under an existing pre-nexus contractual obligation. Grantees are technically allowed to undertake physical work under those contractual obligations that were entered into prior to the federal nexus and can incur those activity costs that are or were performed anytime after the federal nexus as hard costs, and they could potentially be eligible for repayment. So the reason for this is because if you as a grantee had already entered into a contractual obligation prior to the project becoming federalized or prior to the enactment date or the federal nexus date, HUD can't really tell you outright that you cannot move forward with that project. You have a contractual obligation to move forward with those activities. Now, it is considered best practice, and HUD will always encourage the best practice of stopping all work after the federal nexus if it is at all possible. And this is because even though you are allowed to move forward and perform activities after the federal nexus that are associated with that pre-nexus contractual obligation, grantees would be doing so. They would be moving forward at their own risk. And that's because all work that has or will take place after the federal nexus date, regardless of your pre-nexus contractual obligation status, must be covered by a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. And you can find additional insights on this guidance from HUD to the CPF grantees on page 2 and page 3 of the fiscal year 23 Community Project Funding Environmental guidance, and scenarios. And there will be a link for that document at the end of this presentation, but just wanted to draw that out in real time also. So what do we mean by satisfactory environmental review here? A satisfactory environmental review must include an analysis of the applicable environmental laws and authorities, a determination that the project activities will not result in environmental harm that cannot be mitigated, complete all consultation with federal and state agencies in a manner that allows for mitigation measures or conditions to be implemented, and request for release of funds and certification for projects that have been approved by the HUD CPD Field Office Director, if required, depending on the level of review. The satisfactory environmental review must cover all related project activities performed after the federal nexus, except for soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs. HUD has already completed that satisfactory environmental review for those soft costs, but a satisfactory review must cover all related project activities performed after the federal nexus date of December 29, 2022. And a satisfactory environmental review must show that the project will not result in any unmitigatable environmental harm, and a satisfactory environmental review must also show that the project was able to complete all necessary consultations with environmental review authorities for any work already performed. If a satisfactory environmental review cannot be completed for the project for any reason, the grantee will need to reach out to their grant officer to discuss any options such as repurposing of funds, or usually repurposing the funds towards soft costs. The projects that have pre-nexus contractual obligations, this can be a real problem for them because as the work, again, is technically allowed to proceed prior to the completion of the environmental review, any work that you have under that pre-nexus contractual obligation still needs to be covered by a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. So some of these situations will require after the fact or midstream consultations with environmental authorities for activities that have already been performed. And that's typically not how consultations are done for environmental review. And it's not usually how we do in consultations for environmental authorities. We usually do those consultations and reviews prior to those activities being carried out. But some of these situations, again, will require that after the fact or midstream consultations with environmental authorities for those activities that have already been performed. There are some environmental authorities that are much less likely to agree to these midstream or post-activity consultations, such as the State Historic Preservation Officer and the Fish and Wildlife Services for Endangered Species. Some laws and authorities, such as when dealing with floodplains and floodways on a site, could also require compliance and decision-making processes that may not be achievable after the work has already occurred. And we are seeing, particularly with the state historic preservation offices, that in some places they are refusing to consult on projects that have performed physical work, such as demolition or rehabilitation on properties that are already listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's especially projects that the State Historic Preservation Office believes intentionally adversely affected a historic property to avoid the requirements of Section 6, which is the historic review. So the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has provided some guidance on this that states that applicants and federal agencies should avoid any commitments or activities that harm historic properties prior to completing Section 106 historic review process, which is part of the HUD environmental review process. Note that there are ongoing internal coordination meetings that are happening with the federal preservation officer and HUD, the OEE, along with the National Conference of State Historic Preservation to try and coordinate on some solutions and paths forward to some of these issues. But this is still a very real consideration that projects should be aware of. So again, technically, we're talking about pre-nexus contractual obligations. If you entered into a contract prior to the federal nexus for work to be performed after the federal nexus, the best practice is to stop all work until the environmental review is complete. However, HUD cannot mandate you to stop if you already have that pre-nexus obligation to carry out that work. And if you can stop, then stop. If you can't, technically you are allowed to move forward, but again, you're doing so at your own risk, because if you cannot achieve a satisfactory environmental review, including all necessary consultations with the environmental authorities, then the project cannot be funded as it is. And you'll have to discuss with your grant officer what options you may have to move forward. So this next slide shows the CPF process flow for fiscal year 2023, which many of you may already be familiar with. This particular graphic can be found in the CPF guidance and scenarios document on the HUD Exchange. This offers a visual breakdown of when both soft and hard costs are allowed to be incurred and when grantees can request payment for those activities in relation to the environmental review and grant agreement execution process. So key takeaway here for fiscal 23 grantees are allowed to incur soft costs from the date of enactment, December 29, 2022, but these must be those soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs. If you have soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50, those can be incurred. Again, if not, then if you have soft costs that are not part of that Part 50, you need to complete that separate review. And again, HUD encourages all physical work to stop after the federal nexus until the environmental review is completed. Grantees are technically allowed to incur ongoing hard costs at their own risk after the federal nexus, but only for activities that were already part of the pre-nexus contractual obligation. And ongoing means you had a pre-nexus contractual obligation and you have these ongoing hard costs that you're obligated to perform. I want to articulate one more time that allowable nuance that having a pre-nexus contract makes. If you incurred costs after the nexus date and they weren't part of your pre-nexus contractual obligation and you're moving forward with hard cost work, that would be considered a choice limiting action. But because you have a pre-nexus contractual obligation to perform that work, it technically is not considered a choice limiting action violation. So we say that technically you can carry them out after the federal nexus and prior to the environmental review. but we say that you're doing so at your own risk because the project will only be eligible for repayment if all of those post-nexus activities are covered by a satisfactory environmental review showing no unmitigatable harm and an environmental review that you are able to do all of your necessary consultations with environmental authorities. After the grant agreement has been executed for a project, the grantee can start requesting payment of covered soft costs. And then once the grant agreement and the environmental review have been completed, the grantee may undertake all eligible activities and request payment for all remaining eligible project funds. This slide here is a logic tree chart that we put together to assist grantees and grant officers in quickly and easily determining which project costs are eligible for repayment. This logic tree illustrates what we just covered in the previous slide. These can also be found on the CPF Environmental Review Guidance and Scenarios document, and there is also a link to them on the CPF landing page on the HUD Exchange. There are separate charts for fiscal 22 and 23 respectively. There are also a couple of important caveats that apply to both charts. First, this chart assumes that eligible costs are for activities covered by the project scope of a satisfactory environmental review, meaning that any time you're using this chart and reach a determination that costs are eligible for repayment, the corresponding activities must be included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. If some costs or activities are not covered by the project environmental review or by HUD's Part 15 nationwide review for CPF soft costs, then those activities or costs are not eligible for repayment. Second, costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. This chart also provides a link to HUD's nationwide Part 50 review for CPF soft costs, which lists all soft costs covered in the project description and indicates a few supporting docs that might be necessary to make a determination of reimbursement eligibility. So trying to make connections to all the different resources throughout this process. And I think it's worth repeating that costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. This slide includes a list of questions that might be helpful for the grant officer to ask the grantee early on in order to get an idea of their situation as it will relate to repayment eligibility and environmental review considerations. So the grant officer may ask these questions. These would be questions that you can also ask of your own project. So any hard cost activities performed or completed prior to the federal next, sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. Any hard cost activities performed or completed prior to the federal nexus date? If yes, those activities would not be eligible for repayment and do not need to be included in the scope of the environmental review. Any soft cost activities performed prior to the date of legislative enactment, also not eligible for repayment and do not need to be included in the scope of the environmental review. Any pre-nexus contractual obligations that involve hard cost activities to be performed after the federal nexus. This is the best practice is to stop all physical work after the nexus, but grantee can technically proceed with performing activities that are part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation, but doing so at their own risk. Any contracts, commitments entered into, or other choice limiting actions taken following the federal nexus, not including activities associated with pre-nexus contracts, If so, this would constitute a choice limiting action violation and should be referred to regional environmental officer for next steps. Okay, here we have a resource slide as promised. So here you can see, or you can find, a lot of great environmental review resources specific to the community project funding program. So you have your CPF, excuse me, the CPF environmental guidance and scenarios document that was mentioned throughout the presentation. There's the environmental review process guidance. This is guidance for documenting the environmental review record for CPF grants. Cost eligibility chart, went through this in the presentation. Here's a environmental review training link, good series on environmental review process. And here again is the Part 50 programmatic environmental review for soft costs. And now I'll stop here and see if
We do have one question.
we do have one question. Okay,
Yes, so
take it
far.
away.
Looking ahead, if you have grants from 2 fiscal years for the same project, this is 23-24 in this case, does the ER from the 23 grant carry over to the funding for 24, or will another review need to be done? It's possible we would be under construction and incurring costs by the time they get the agreements for the second year of funding, second round of funding. So we can give broad answers, general answers here, and you would want to take some things that we say and follow up with your grant officer more than likely. But Patrick, I think that it depends on if the environmental review being done is for the entire project, or if your
Agreed.
environmental review is only done for the 23 part, then you're going to have to do another one to cover the 24 part. But if you are doing the entire project, then I would think that it would, again, you want to confirm with your grant officer, this is going to be the case in this specific situation, but what do you think?
I agree. It's normally you're doing your environmental review considering all the different funding sources that play a part in doing that project. And if you are able to consider the funding from 2024 into that project, that would follow that methodology. But not knowing or fully, yeah, not just plain not knowing what guidance there might be for 2024, I would definitely check.
Okay, and we have another question that's long and admittedly upfront may be complicated. So let's see. Working with environmental review contract to come up with a tiered environmental review. So it'll be the tier 1 and tier 2 review. They're getting anxious to get their grant contract signed, the paperwork submitted. If half of the funding will be used for planning, admin, grant management, and maintenance, which is covered by the soft cost environmental review HUD did, can we submit our materials and conduct the separate tier 1 and tier 2 reviews, though the specific counties involved after the contract is signed? So they've already asked this of the grant officer, but I think I need to read this again. I'm not quite sure.
Yes.
Are you certain what they're
I-
asking? Maybe someone could come off mute, Kristen, and kind of give us a little more detail. Or do we have to let her off mute?
Oh, sure. I can attempt to
You are.
clarify.
Okay.
Ours is approximately half of our funding is going into staff time for planning and all of that for our program. And approximately the other half is money that we would be spending for some of our partner organizations. Oh, I apologize for the dog. For our partner organizations for things like down payment assistance, stuff like that, that's tied to properties that we don't know where they are yet, but we've identified 5 pilot counties. So we have been advised to work with those counties for the environmental reviews for those pilot locations that we don't know where the houses will be built yet. But we really want to get our our grant signed and everything, all our paperwork submitted. So I'm trying to figure out if we can submit that with this like nationwide environmental review, and then separately focus on getting those the state environmental or the county environmental reviews. They said we'd have to do a tier 1 and a tier 2 review with those counties. I'm not sure if I clarified that anymore,
No,
but
I think
basically we're
so.
trying to figure out when we can submit our paperwork to get a signed contract.
Right. So the environmental, I'll let Patrick weigh in too, but the environmental review is about spending money. It's not about getting your contract signed. So you can get your grant agreement processed. It really comes down to when you're spending the money. So if you get your grant agreement processed, has nothing to do with environmental review. The activities that you're discussing, provided they're covered by that soft cost environmental review done by HUD, that's allowable. It's when you come down to spending money, as Patrick's been talking about with the choice limiting actions, that's when you have to stop until the environmental review is completed. Patrick,
Okay.
did I miss anything?
Thank you.
No. And we're also it's a great question. We're working on an interactive workflow that shows that very thing that you mentioned, Stan, that it is encouraged that grantees work to get their agreement signed, while also working on, if possible, that environmental review process. So that agreement can absolutely be signed prior to the environmental review for all those different activities are complete.
Okay, that's very helpful because we thought we had to know exactly, I guess it wouldn't be the results of the review, but we needed to know what our process that we would follow for the review before we submitted it. But now that we have our plan, then it sounds like we could submit it.
Yes, and I think, Stan, you've postured that in a really good way, that the agreement is separate from the agreement would allow you to draw soft costs. The agreement plus the environmental review, satisfactory completion of that environmental review, would allow you to draw the hard costs related to the activities under that environmental review. Does that make sense? So you need them. So you need the agreement allows you to draw soft costs. The agreement plus the completion of the satisfactory review allows you to draw all the other types of costs. Does that make sense? Or did
It
that
does to
muddy
me. No.
Okay.
All right, Kristen's giving us a thumbs up. We're good
Okay,
with
very
her.
good.
Okay. All right. All right. We have an architect draw plans before an environmental review. When the plans be needed to do the environmental review to see the impact. I believe you answered your own question. So yes, yeah, that's part of the the design, and that's certainly part of the soft cost that's had the nationwide review. So you absolutely can do architectural design prior to design and some engineering studies prior to the completion of the environmental review. Did I miss anything?
Nope.
All right. Okay, so another environmental review and grant agreement question. The complication for us is the project involves purchasing a property to renovate a house for newly arrived refugees. It has taken us for time to find the right house. Okay, so they haven't been able to do the grant agreement because they don't know the location. They now have a location in mind, but think we need to make sure there are not environmental issues before we purchase it. We cannot detail the work that'll be done to the house until we have the house. However, it seems like we can't do the contract until we have the house. So what you're saying is the narrative, the budget, you would struggle with the budget until you have the house identified and submitting the budget. Is that kind of what I'm hearing, Deirdre? And so, yeah, go ahead.
Can I speak? Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's sort of a chicken and egg situation. Is we kind of started thinking that, okay, it would be great to get this grant agreement in, but you have to submit detailed costs. And we could have submitted a dummy, budget, which in effect we
Yeah,
kind of
but-
did in our application, our initial application for the funding. But then we would have to obviously submit follow-ups and adjustments once we knew what the actual true costs would be. And so this is sort of a question, and we've had a hard time really getting
I
information
think it's
about.
gonna be hard. I guess I have two thoughts. One is I think it's going to be hard to get your budget and narrative done if you don't know the site yet. At least have an option on the site.
Yes,
And I guess that's real. I mean, the other thing, and I guess I don't like this option, would be to put in your budget the entire amount of what you think is going to be. But as you noted, that would pretty much guarantee that you're going to come back in and do a budget amendment. And it may also result in questions from your grant officer and want to know where you came up with the budget from when you don't have a site yet.
well, exactly. So basically, I guess that, what my question is we without being able to get an answer, it's great to have a conversation. We just decided that that was the best approach. And it sounds like you're confirming that we have followed the best approach by just sort of waiting and hanging steady until we have the actual house. And let me tell you, we actually think we do now have the house. So we put it in the offer. We put it in an offer, but of course we don't have information about, are there environmental concerns? It's a residential house. It's not in an area that we think there's going to be any issues. It's not next to, say an old gas station or
Okay.
some kind of super fun site. But this is sort of it's a question of, you must have situations like this, I would imagine.
So one thing to remember is that you can, buying property is a choice limiting action that Patrick's been discussing.
Yes.
You can do a agreement. HUD has given guidance on how to do an option or how to do a conditional contract, where if it doesn't, where you would tie up the land, but you aren't going to close until the successful completion of an environmental review. So you would want to.
Did I find that? Where would
You want to Google, go to the HUD exchange and search for option contracts, and that guidance will come up.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's so helpful.
Patrick, did I miss anything?
No.
Okay, I'm trusting you're going to jump in if I start to go off course, right?
I was just thinking of, I feel like we talked about one of the something similar to that earlier today.
Oh, yes, we did,
Yeah,
didn't we? Yes.
That's what I was thinking. I'm like,
Yeah.
tracking right along. So
and then David had a follow-up question about, after you do the design, provided the design, we're giving general broad answers to questions, but his question related to doing the architectural work before the environmental review. And then yes, as long as the design work's done after that federal nexus date that Patrick gave us earlier, it would be an eligible expense that you would get reimbursed for the
Yes.
cost of the review of the architectural plans, rather. Okay. I'm not.
Jed,
Go ahead.
don't be afraid to click on that soft cost link also there to give you some additional feedback on what it is that we're sharing here.
And a level of comfort that what you're paying
Yes.
for is covered by
Yep.
that. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. It is 3:22. We can finish 8 minutes early, perhaps. But if not, we're welcome to stay as long as people have questions.
Absolutely.
Within reason.
Within reason in the next 8 minutes.
Yes. Well, I was thinking more like, 6:30, 7 o'clock.
I'll have you stay on.
All right. All right. Looks like there aren't any more questions. I don't see any hands raised or no one coming off mute.
All right. Very
All
good.
right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll stick around
Yes.
for a minute or two to see if anybody else comes up with anything, but otherwise have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all for participating.
All right, I think we've done it. We can end the recording and